Hello, Chris Green here with the Flood Insurance Guru. Hey, remember, if you've got questions about flood insurance, flood education, flood zone changes, elevation certificates, click below to visit our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. You can also check out our daily flood education videos on our YouTube channel. Remember, we have an educational background on flood mitigation, which means we can help you understand flood risks like this right here, your flood insurance, and mitigating your property long term to help you minimize flood losses and flood premiums.
Today we're talking about what is the difference in flood zones. You've heard about all these different flood zones. So today we're going to talk about what some differences are. We're going to talk about mandatory versus non-mandatory. We're going to talk about low risk compared to high risk. And we're going to talk about some of the general zones across the country. So let's talk about mandatory and non-mandatory zones first. These kind of go hand in hand with high risk and low risk. A mandatory flood zone is a flood zone that you're in where your mortgage company is requiring you to purchase flood insurance. This generally means you're in a special flood hazard area. That means you're in the 100-year flood zone like you can see right here behind us, or the 1% annual chance of a flood event occurring. As we mentioned, if you have a mortgage company, more than likely you're going to be required to purchase flood insurance here. Now, if you don't have a mortgage, generally you're not if there's not an additional interest. But it's still really important that you know that you're in that special flood hazard area or that mandatory zone, especially if you go to sell your house. So what about non-mandatory zones or, low risk flood zones? You've got low risk or non-mandatory, which are going to be areas where it's not necessarily required, but this is also where people get into very dangerous situations where they don't carry it. For example, during Hurricane Harvey, a large portion of those areas were in low risk flood zones and they didn't carry flood insurance. And when this happened, they didn't have anything to pay for them when they had all these losses. The same thing can be said for the Baton Rouge flooding in 2016. Where a lot of people were in low risk flood zones and didn't have it. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the different flood zones. We're talking about mandatory, we're talking about special flood hazard area. Let's start with low risk or non-mandatory.
So today we're talking about what is flood zone X. These are low risk flood zones, non-mandatory zones. You see here right behind me, there's no water, so you think there's no risk of flooding, correct? Well, that's not exactly what flood zone X means. What flood zone X really means is just a minimum risk. You're not in a high risk zone, you're not in a moderate zone, but you're in a low risk. And it's non-mandatory generally by mortgage companies, but it doesn't mean there's no risk of flooding. So this is what flood zone X is.
Now let's talk about some of the mandatory zones. And there's really going to be two main zones we're talking about here. And we're going to go a little deeper in these zones. What we're talking about is flood zone A.
What is a flood zone A? Flood zone A is considered special flood zone hazard areas. This is where flood insurance is going to be required. It's always going to be required in any type of A zone. You've got several like A99, AE, AH, AO, and then just regular A. It could flood. While this is not the highest risk flood zone A, it is still a mandatory zone.
And flood zone V. Talking about coastal flood zones, we're particularly talking about V zones. These are coastal high hazard areas. These are areas that are susceptible to wave flooding, high tide flooding during a hurricane and things like that. These are still part of the 100-year flood zone. Flood zone V, flood insurance is still going to be required. So that's a brief description of what flood zone V is. Now what's important to also understand with flood zone V compared to A and AE is, on flood zone V, when you're in these V zones, FEMA actually uses the replacement cost of your property as a factor in determining rates. And so that's also why rates are generally significantly higher with a V zone compared to an A zone or AE zone. So if you're right along here on the beach, then you very well could be in a V zone. Now these are all different flood zones. As I said, we mentioned we got flood zone A, flood zone V that we've talked about. We've talked about mandatory, we've talked about non-mandatory. We've talked about low risk, we've talked about high risk. It's important to understand what some of the differences are. So if you've got questions about these flood zones, which one you might be in, what are your flood insurance options in these flood zones? Click below to visit our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. Thank you.